billionaire returns home expecting to find his daughter safe, loved, and cared for. Instead, he's met with a chilling sight: his little girl, frail and hungry, begging for food. Not from a neighbor, not from a friend, but from the black maid of the family next door. How could the child of unimaginable wealth end up in such desperation? And why was no one there to protect her? Beneath this heartbreaking moment lies a story of betrayal, neglect, and prejudice that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about privilege, power, and humanity. What he uncovers will shock you. Before the tragedy unfolded, life for billionaire Richard Lawson was a picture of control and success. His name carried weight in boardrooms. His decisions shifted markets, and his wealth built a world where he believed his only daughter, Emily, would never know struggle. She lived in a mansion surrounded by marble halls, endless toys, and every luxury a child could imagine. From the outside, it was the perfect life, safe, protected, and untouchable. But beneath the polished surface, cracks had already begun to show. Richard traveled constantly for business, leaving his daughter in the care of her mother. And when her mother left on an extended trip to China, the responsibility fell into the hands of someone else entirely, a caretaker who appeared trustworthy but hid neglect behind a convincing smile. Emily, only 8 years old, was too innocent to understand how quickly love could turn into abandonment. Days passed where the fridge stayed empty, meals were skipped, and the laughter of her father's promises seemed like a distant memory. All around her, the vast wealth of her family meant nothing, because what she needed most wasn't money but care. The seeds of betrayal had been planted, but Richard had no idea what awaited him. As he prepared to return home after months abroad, he believed his daughter was safe. What he would discover instead would shatter him and expose a reality no amount of wealth could erase. When Richard's private jet touched down, he was consumed with relief. After months of grueling negotiations overseas, he was finally back where his heart belonged, home with his daughter. He imagined her running into his arms, smiling with the innocence only children carry. But the moment he stepped into the mansion, silence greeted him. No laughter, no footsteps, just cold emptiness echoing through gilded halls. At first, he brushed it off. Perhaps Emily was napping or out playing in the yard. But room by room, his search turned frantic. The toys scattered across the floor felt untouched, the dining table untouched. Something wasn't right. The caretaker who was supposed to watch over Emily was nowhere to be found. And the longer Richard searched, the heavier the dread pressed against his chest. Then, just as panic began to overwhelm him, a neighbor's hushed words pierced the air. He followed the voice, stepping into the backyard fence line. And there it was, a sight that would forever haunt him. His daughter, frail and hungry, was standing at the back door of the neighboring house, clutching her stomach, begging for food. But the heartbreak deepened when Richard saw who opened the door, a black maid employed by the family next door. With tenderness, she offered Emily bread and water. Her eyes carried no judgment, only compassion for a child who had been failed by those meant to love her most. Yet as Richard approached, whispers spread quickly through the neighborhood. How could the child of a billionaire be reduced to begging from a servant? It didn't take long for the ugly undercurrent to surface. Some neighbors mocked the sight, muttering that it was shameful for a man of Richard's stature to allow his daughter to depend on help. Others twisted the moment into a cruel reflection of race and class, sneering that the child had stooped so low as to seek kindness from someone they themselves had long looked down upon. Richard's stomach churned. This wasn't just about his daughter's hunger. It was about the world she had stumbled into, one poisoned by prejudice and judgment. And as he listened, the words cut deeper. Accusations that Emily was ungrateful, whispers that the maid had crossed a line by showing compassion, insinuations that kindness from her was somehow inappropriate. For the first time in his life, Richard saw the fragile line between privilege and humanity. His wealth had built walls, but those walls had crumbled, leaving his daughter vulnerable to the cruelty of both neglect and racism. The caretaker had vanished, abandoning Emily entirely. Days had passed with no food, no care, no protection, and in that absence only one person had stepped forward, the very woman others dismissed as invisible, the maid who gave her what no money could buy, dignity. Yet Richard's relief at finding Emily alive was clouded by rage. Rage at the betrayal of the caretaker, who left his child to starve. Rage at the neighbors who turned a moment of compassion into a spectacle of prejudice. and rage at himself for being blind to the danger he had placed his daughter in by trusting the wrong people. But the story was far from over. As Richard tried to thank the maid, he noticed the sharp glares from the house she served. Her employers stood behind her, arms folded, disapproval etched on their faces. Their silence spoke volumes. In their eyes, her act of kindness was not a gesture of humanity, but a betrayal of social order. Richard now stood at a crossroads, unaware that the confrontation ahead would not only test his strength as a father, but force him to confront the racism he had ignored for far too long. The confrontation erupted like a storm. Richard, clutching his frail daughter in his arms, turned to thank the maid who had saved her. But before he could speak, the maid's employers stepped forward. Their words were sharp, dripping with disdain as they scolded her for overstepping her place. To them, feeding a starving child wasn't compassion, it was defiance. Richard's fury boiled. How could they stand there in their comfortable home, condemning the one person who showed humanity? But the venom didn't stop there. Neighbors gathered, whispering, pointing, their words slicing like knives. They questioned Richard's worth as a father, sneered at his failure to protect his daughter, and hurled insults at the maid, suggesting she had acted out of self-interest, or worse, that she should have turned Emily away. For Richard, the truth landed like a crushing weight. This wasn't just about his daughter's suffering. It was about a community so blinded by prejudice that kindness itself became an offense. His wealth, his status, his power, none of it mattered in the face of this twisted injustice. Emily's small voice broke through the chaos, trembling yet clear. She fed me when no one else would. Her words silenced the crowd for a heartbeat, but only a heartbeat. Then came the scoffs, the mutters, the hardened stares that revealed just how deep the rot of racism and judgment ran. Richard realized he stood at the edge of a choice: remain silent, allowing the poison of hate to fester, or speak out, risking everything to defend both his daughter and the woman who had shown her mercy. The air grew heavy, every eye fixed on him. His next words, his next actions would decide not only how his daughter remembered this day, but what kind of man he truly was. Richard's decision was swift and unshakable. Holding Emily close, he turned to the crowd, not with the polished composure of a billionaire, but with the rawness of a father pushed to his breaking point. He condemned the caretaker who abandoned his child, but he reserved his strongest words for the poisonous prejudice on display. He reminded them all that kindness has no rank, no skin color, no place. It is the purest measure of humanity. The maid stood silently, fear flickering in her eyes as though expecting punishment for her compassion. But Richard shielded her with his presence, declaring her the only one who had acted with dignity when others looked away. In that moment, the balance of power shifted. What the wealthy and entitled tried to use as shame became her victory, and his awakening. The days that followed were not easy. Rumors spread, reputations were tested, and Richard faced harsh scrutiny from those who thrived on judgment. Yet none of it mattered, because in the silence of his daughter's room, as she healed with strength far beyond her years, he knew the truth. No fortune, no status, no title could protect a child from neglect, or erase the ugliness of racism. Emily would never forget the day she was fed by someone the world tried to overlook. And Richard would never again turn a blind eye to the injustice that thrived in the shadows of privilege. The story leaves us with a haunting question. In a world overflowing with wealth and power, why is it often those with the least who show the most humanity? And when faced with injustice, do we stay silent or do we stand even if it costs us everything?